Hello, Stephen Schaub, leader of the Digital Revolution 2.0 here on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about an alternative method to processing your film using DDX, developer by Ilford, but instead of doing it 1 to 4, we're going to do it 1 to 9 as a stand development. This is really a great combination with a lot of films. It has a huge developer film latitude, and the grain structure and everything is just really beautiful. So two of my favorite films that I like to do this for is Fomapan 100, which is a real bread and butter film for me, as well as Ilford Delta 400. I love Ilford Delta 400. Yes, it's a newer, advanced grain technology. It's not a classic grain film like Fomapan 100 is, but what it does have is this really unique look. It has a wonderful vintage sort of quality, really deep blacks, chalky highlights. I like it as a 400 speed film a lot, especially with DDX. So my amazing wife, Eve, has agreed to pose for me today very generously. Thank you, Eve.
You're welcome.
And today we're going to be shooting with my Plaubel Makina 670. I've got loaded up right now a roll of the Fomapan 100. And what we're going to do is we're going to determine what the usable developer film latitude range is. Now, what do I mean by that? You know, a lot of times when you process a film, say Fomapan 100, let's say you're going to do it in D76. You'll have a set time to process that film in D76. With this process, what we're looking for is what is the usable range? How many stops over and under can you get and have a good usable negative? So I'm going to expose this film from 800, 400, 200, 150. We're going to run that entire range. And we're going to look at it and say, okay, with a 1 to 9 stand development with DDX, I could probably easily scan from, say, 100 to 800 or 100 to 400. The reason that's important is that it gives you flexibility as a photographer when you're out shooting, and you're not so much thinking about, I'm going to develop for this particular ISO or exposure index. I'm developing for a particular range based upon that film developer latitude. Now, there's one big difference using this technique, is that in previous posts, I've talked about William Mortensen and the idea of exposing for the highlight values and letting the shadow values fall. For this type of technique, I like to expose for the shadows, and I don't worry about the highlights because you're not going to blow them out. But especially as you start really pushing that film to 400, 800, or in the case of Delta 400, 1600 and 3200, if you don't expose for those shadows, you're not going to have them. They're just not going to be there. But because of the compensating quality of this developer and because it's standing, I don't have to worry about the highlights. Eve is so excited.
Woohoo!
Yes. So let's go ahead and take some shots, and then I'll process both rows of film at the same time. That's one of the beauties of doing the stand development. I actually like DDX 1 to 9 better than I like Rodinal 1 to 100. It just has, I think, a nicer quality, and I'll show you what I mean by that quickly here. All right, Evie. So all right, so we're out in the studio. I've got the developer at temp. I'm doing a pre-wet right now. Now with stand development, I do a couple things differently. And it's important to note that this is not like the minimal agitation technique. This is not like the standard technique. This is stand development, and this is the process that I use for all stand developments, whether it's Rodinal, DDX, Cafanol, CL, they all get the same process, the same technique. So what do? First off, I do a 5-minute pre-wet. I know that seems like a long time, but I found out a long time ago that doing stand development with anything less than 5 minutes, in my opinion, gave me crazy uneven development. So really, I do a solid 5 minutes. And what I'll usually do is about a 2 or 3 minute, I'll dump out the water and then fill it with another water and let it sit for that total time of 5 minutes. That's the first difference. The second difference is the number of agitations. If you remember in previous videos, I talk about doing 2 inversions per 5 seconds is my standard. When I do stand development, I do 1 inversion in 5 seconds. And I do it for the first 60 seconds. So for the first 60 seconds, I'm gonna do 1 gentle inversion every single 5 seconds for that entire time. Then I'm gonna tap the tank and I'm gonna let it sit for 45 minutes. That should give us that expansion of speed that we're looking for, that long film developer latitude. I have done tests thinking, well, if 45 minutes is good, what about an hour and a half? What about 2 hours? The reality is there's a point of diminishing return. 45 minutes sort of seems to be the sweet spot. So stay tuned. Hello, so I thought I'd take a few minutes and explain how I meter for stand development because it's a little bit different, and I realized that when I was doing the example of Eve that I needed to step back for a minute and explain this because this is really fundamentally important. And with DDX and stand development, if you do it the way that I'm about to outline, you'll have huge success every single time. So first off, what you're looking for is that expanded dynamic range, that expanded exposure latitude, that great film latitude developer combination, and that's really what you're going for. So when I do stand development, there's two ways that I meter, and it depends on what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for box speed or maybe a little bit of a pull, I meter for the highlights. Absolutely. Same way I've already outlined in the William Mortenson's technique, meter for zone 6, zone 7, the brightest bright that you really care about. Don't worry about your shadows because of stand development, much like our minimum agitation technique, the highlights are going to be protected and the shadows are going to come up, 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 up. It's perfect. So if I had a 100 speed film, say Foma 100, I would meter for the highlights for everything from an exposure index of 25, 50, 100, and maybe 200. 200 would be the edge. I would meter for the highlight, and that would be perfect every single time with that film. However, in the example that I was doing out here, I was looking to push the film a little bit and get more speed out of it. That's why in that example I said meter for the shadows. So by metering for zone 3, zone 4, really more zone 4, what happens is you gain a tremendous amount of speed out of the film. So for instance, on the test that I did, and you'll see the examples in just a few minutes, on Delta 400, it's usable by metering for the shadows from 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, all fits within that developer, film developer range. Whereas Fomapan 100, you'll see is absolutely usable from 100 all the way out to 3200. It's really an incredible film for this type of process. But once again, if I'm looking for speed, anything 2, 3, 4 stops more than box, I'm going to meter for zone 4, zone 3. If I'm looking not so much for speed, but I want to control the values, I want to be somewhere around box speed or less, then I'll meter for that highlight value. So this gives you two different ways to meter on the film. But here's the best part. You can mix and match these two methods of metering on the same roll of film. Because at the end of the day, you're going for a 45-minute processing time. So it doesn't matter if on frame, the wind's blowing my blanket here, it doesn't matter if on frame 1 or frame 2, you do the highlight metering, and then on frame 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you do the shadow metering because the development time is still going to be the same. You're just adjusting the exposure. Are you worried about highlights or are you worried about shadows? And the development, because it's a stand development, will balance it out perfectly. So once again, if you're looking for, let's say I have a 100 speed film. If you're looking for, 100, maybe 200, but also like 50, 25, maybe 12 as sort of that range of tonality, you meter for the highlight. If you're looking for an increase in speed, you got to make sure you keep those shadows. You want to meter for like a zone 3, zone 4. Then you're going to get at least 2, 3, 4, 5 stops more speed out of that film and still maintain beautiful shadows and perfectly controlled highlights. I'll showcase all of this when I show you the film in just a few minutes, but remember, it's a two ways of metering, and you can mix it up on the same roll of film with one development time. Now, in terms of development time, I recommend 45 minutes. However, if your results are coming out a little hot or a little flat, don't hesitate to increase or decrease that time. I've done an hour if I think I need a little more. I've done 30 minutes if I think a little less. Generally speaking, I do 10 or 15 minute adjustments on either end. Just because that sort of seems to be enough to actually see a difference. You're not going to see a difference in 2 minutes with the stand development, the way you would if you were doing standard agitation technique. Another thing to realize is you can test this yourself, and you should. Get a film that you like, doesn't matter what the film is, and try that test. Do a series where you start real low. Let's say you're going to use a 100 speed film. Let's say you're going to use T-Max 100. I just threw that out there. T-Max 100. I would do a set of exposures starting at 6, 12, 25, 50, 100, 200, 400. All metering for the highlight value. Then I'd have a couple blank frames, and then I would do another test where I start at like 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, where I'm metering for the shadows. And then just take that entire roll, stick it in the tank, DDX 1 to 9 for 45 minutes. And what that'll do is, if a little bit of time, you'll be able to look at the negatives and know what that film developer latitude is. So throughout the day, you can be adjusting your film's exposure index based upon the lighting, based upon what you need to maintain, and yet it's all the same processing time. All right, let's start by taking a look at the Fomapan film. Now, what we did here is I have an exposure range from exposure index 100, which is the one we're looking at right now, all the way out to 3200. Now, the 100, which we're looking at, looks really good to my eye. The contrast is well controlled, the sharpness is great, nothing's blowing out on the film, the blacks have beautiful textural detail, the highlights are creamy and just amazing. This is an exposure where I could have gone both ways. The 100, I could have metered for the highlights and it would have been fine. Fomapan film is incredibly flexible. Not all films are. When in doubt, if I was shooting a film at box speed, I would almost always meter for the highlight and not the shadow the way that I did here, but it worked fine. So for this particular case, 100 is absolutely usable. If I was looking for a 50, a 25, a 12, a 6, or a 3 exposure index, and I do work in that range, I would be metering for the highlight value, knowing that the stand development would protect the highlights and the shadows would be there. What I do notice in this negative, because it's overdeveloped really, is there's more grain in the negative than there normally would be. So that's the one trade-off with having done this for the shadows. Generally speaking, I find that when I meter for the shadows, I get about a 2-stop push. So if I'm looking for, if I'm using a 100 speed film, generally speaking, I'll automatically say, well, my minimum exposure index is 400. And then I would do 4, 8, 16, 32, somewhere in there. 200 would be usable, but 100, as I can see here, the grain is bigger than it should be. That's just because it's overdeveloping. However, it's still very usable. Let's take a look at the 200, and what you see is the grain is already way smaller. The tonality is just a little more beautiful. I mean, everything is just looking great. 200 to me, 200, 320, you know, somewhere in there is really the start point for me for Fomapan 100 using this particular process. Let's take a look at 400. 400 is absolutely drop dead gorgeous. So when I'm doing this technique, I generally speaking with Fomapan 100 will use 400, 800, 1600 as like my shadow metering stand development exposure latitude. 32 is usable, 200 is usable. If I want 150, 25, 12, as I said again, I would do the highlight metering for those. But 400 looks really great. If we look at 800, 800 is absolutely gorgeous. If you had to ask me where the sweet spot was, I would say somewhere between 4 and 800 really is the sweet spot. You're getting the best grain, best sharpness, best contrast control. It just has a tremendous presence. But if we move on to 1600, you can just now start to see that the shadow is starting to crush just a little tiny bit. However, I could open these shadows up in a million different ways. All of these scans, I should emphasize, are, you know, I'm in the scanning software, adjusting the curve a little tiny bit. Almost no adjustment whatsoever, by the way, between the 400 and 800. When I was at the 200, 100, I'd have to pull the curve down a little bit. When I get to 1600, I've got to push it up a little bit. But with a little bit of effort, I could open those shadows up even more if I wanted, or if I like this visual aesthetic, I could say fine. And then here it is at 3200, and you can see there's not a tremendous difference between the 16 and 32. If you were to go to 64, you would notice a pretty big drop. Fomapan film just sort of dies at that. And by the way, I'm very aware that I'm doing these exposures on an afternoon. Now, it was dark outside when I kind of shot these, but I'm doing these in an afternoon light. So if you were shooting in really low light, as long as you meter for those shadow values, 3200 will still work. I'm not telling you it's not going to be thin and dark and very noir, but you will get a very usable exposure with a very long range of tones. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Delta 400. What's interesting is that the Delta 400, when you look at it, it has a whisker more grain in some cases, especially when you're at that sweet spot, than the Fomapan 100 does. And of course, the reason is you've got a 100 speed film versus a 400 speed film. This is one of the advantages of this process too, is that you can really exploit fine grain 150 and 200 speed films and get speed out of it and yet have grain that's still incredibly fine. But I think the Delta 400 looks gorgeous. Once again though, just like with the Fomapan, the 400 to me is a little grainier than it should be. And that's because, once again, it's been overexposed a little too much based upon the 45-minute stand development time. If I had metered the 400 for the highlights, it would be perfect. So Delta 400, I would very comfortably rate it 50, 100, 200, 400, metering for the highlights, it'd be spot on. And what you're going to see here is it does incredibly well as we go up into higher speeds. So let's take a look at 800. 800 looks amazing. It's absolutely beautiful. But when you get to 16, it really shines. Once again, I find that the pushing element really is a stop and a half to 2 stops more than whatever box speed is. So right here at 1600, man, this just looks gorgeous. And guess what? 3200 looks really spectacular as well. If you start to look in that far tree there in the background, on that butternut tree, you can see the deep shadows there on the left are starting to disappear just a little bit. I'm fine with that personally, but if you're really concerned about that, 32 is where they start to disappear. And when you get to 64, they're kind of gone. However, once again, as I said, I did no real work on these files. I'm sure I could go in, because I've seen there is detail still in those shadows on the negatives. I could spend 10 minutes and pull it up and balance the contrast a little more. I think that the Delta 400 is really usable out to somewhere between 64, maybe close to 10,000, somewhere in there as an exposure index. But once again, a lot of it's going to depend on you accurately metering for that zone 4 shadow. Just like on the opposite end, you're metering for that zone 6, zone 7 highlight. All right, so I just finished making the video here in the studio and I realized I don't have a conclusion. So here's the conclusion. Go try this. Experiment with different films. See what you like and what you don't like. Could you do this experiment with Rodinal? Sure. But there are advantages with the DDX, especially if you're working in smaller format like 35 millimeter. DDX is going to give you a much finer grain negative than Rodinal will, especially in 35. It's a really great way to shoot. It'll take you a little bit of time to sort of train your eye to sort of think about, what speed do I need? Oh, now I have to meter for the highlights. Or what speed do I need in order to get it? I need to meter for the shadows. But that's really all there is to it. And once you know what that film developer exposure latitude is, you can choose anything within it. You'll also probably find that you've got one speed for the high and one speed for the low that you like. Like for me, if I was using the Fomapan, I like it at 50 or 100 for the highlight metering, and I like it at 800, for the shadow metering. That's not to say I won't use the other exposures. As you saw in the video, it's really incredible. But that's just sort of the way that I work with it. In terms of cost, DDX is not the cheapest developer, but for 35 millimeter, you're only talking 75 cents per roll. For 120, you're only talking $1.50 a roll. That's not too bad. So thank you very much for listening. Have a great day and go shoot some film.